Today I posted a tweet on Twitter. I didn't post on X. I don't know what that is. Posted on Twitter. And the tweet said Christians everywhere should be grateful that the new atheists hammered them on biblical violence in the 2000s, because that was a key catalyst for apologists beginning to take the problem seriously in the 2010s. And I want to say a little bit about that in this video. Spent a lot of time dunking on the new atheists, that their books, like back in the day, Sam Harris book, which has now been 20 years since it came out, The End of Faith, and then Letter to a Christian Nation, or Dawkins, God Delusion, or um, Hitchens, um, How Religion Poisons Everything, blah, blah, blah. These books, Dennett, they were not particularly deep. They were not theologically informed. They were somewhat um, screeds, right? They were written with a high dependence upon rhetoric and not a lot of careful and charitable argument, and that's all true. But you can't deny that they did hammer on some important points. I think the most salient one coming out of 9/11 and the tragedy of 9/11 and its linkage between geopolitical terrorism and religious ideology was how that could be traced to violence within the holy texts of the Western monotheisms, Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And probably the most famous passage that came out of all of this came from Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, the master wordsmith, where he writes, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." I'm sure you've heard that passage before. It's oft been quoted. That's just a little snippet of Dawkins' rhetorical broadside at the violence of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, and God as portrayed in the Old Testament. And yes, there's not a lot of argument there. It's just stentorian fury wrapped up in a rhetorical flourish. However, passages like this precisely did provide a catalyst to force Christian apologists to deal squarely with the problem of biblical violence. Now, Christians were beginning to do so at the time or even before the New Atheists. So there was a Four Views book on biblical violence that came out in the wake of 9/11, which offered different views, the most provocative of which was C.J. Cowell's, I believe his name was. And there were other things. Does the Bible Justify Violence was a little booklet written by a biblical scholar at this time. So there were some other people beginning to really explore this issue. But it was the New Atheists, no doubt, that really forced this conversation to go mainstream. And for that, I think we should be grateful. And I can talk about it from my own personal experience. So it was Paul Copan in 2008 who wrote an article in Philosophia Christi, which was a response to Dawkins and the other new atheists critiquing Christians on biblical violence. And I found Copan's article response in Philosophia Christi to be terribly unsatisfactory. So I wrote a critical rebuttal, which was published the next year in another edition of Philosophia Christi, along with other essays by people like Wes Morriston, who were also critiquing um, Copan. And for me, that initiated me falling squarely within this conversation. And so from then on, I did a conference presentation paper, and I did many blog articles and podcasts and debates, ultimately culminating in my 2020 or 2021 book, Jesus Loves Canaanites. All of that came out of people like Dawkins. The fact that they pressed this issue in the 2000s meant that in the 2010s and into the 2020s now, there's been an explosion of Christians and others talking about these issues and saying, look, as Christians, apologists, biblical scholars, theologians, philosophers, we have to address these issues squarely. And I'm grateful then for the new atheists. Yeah, their critiques were unformed. There wasn't, in some respects, a lot of substance to them, but perhaps that was just what we needed at that time in terms of its rhetorical force, that it really prompted Christians to begin to explore more satisfactory ways to address the problem of evil. And this, for me, is just part of a bigger question or a bigger reminder, I should say, that whether it's the new atheists or other critics of Christianity or whatever your belief system may be, you can learn a lot from the critics. And you can develop as iron sharpens iron through the criticisms raised by the critics. So don't ever forget that. Don't forget the extent to which we can learn from critics and should therefore be grateful for their input in challenging us to become more adept at understanding our beliefs and defending the beliefs that we hold.